The retreat from Afghanistan takes an extremely grim turn, with consequences being felt across the world. Excess deaths and supply chain chaos are evident as the consequences of COVID lockdowns continue to emerge, and Joe Biden's 3-month inquiry into the origins of COVID-19 is reportedly over. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. The retreat from Afghanistan, which was already an extremely grim affair, has become a whole lot more so this week with the twin bomb attack on people at the airport. Having been chafing against the Taliban all this time, who are promising amnesty for people who worked for the previous regime, even as reports filter out that they're going door to door trying to hunt those people down. But it turned out that on the Afghan scale, they are the moderates. The Islamic State in Khorasan province, ISIS-K, is looking to present itself as the real radical alternative to the Taliban, who it considers hopelessly compromised by the fact that it went to bargain with Trump. The highly vulnerable ongoing situation of American and UK soldiers caught in this tightly constrained geographical location, with vast crowds of people declaring their horror of recent events by trying to leave the country, that seemed like an open invitation to them, and they took it. You no doubt know the outcome: a dozen US Marines dead, many more Afghans dead and others injured, and raging impotence. Because in the short term, thanks to the decision chain that led to this point, there's nothing they can do about it. American and British troops are there at the pleasure of the Taliban. The Taliban have obstructed them, prevented them from getting out a lot of the people that they want to get to, and they've just had to take it and carry on, because at least that way they get to reach some of the people. This is what happens when you withdraw your military personnel before you evacuate your civilians. Plain and simple. President Biden spoke to the American people yesterday and continued to talk tough in the face of what everyone but him seems to agree has been a massive miscalculation. The people who did this, he said, "We will hunt you down," which is easy to say. But the point is that he's declaring an item for the medium-term to-do list. In the short term, American forces have little capacity to strike back, indeed little capacity to protect themselves from further attacks. They are sitting ducks, dependent on the Taliban to successfully intercept ISIS-K members who are intent on deadly violence, because the Taliban control everything outside the airport. And ceding that total control has led America to have to coordinate with the Taliban in rather astonishing ways, such as handing the Taliban lists of the names of people the US aimed to evacuate, including the names of Afghans who served alongside the US forces, as well as dual nationals. Now, this is becoming something of a habit. We've already seen Joe Biden handing a list of strategic infrastructure to Vladimir Putin, asking him not to hack them. And now it's gone as far as handing the Taliban a list of people that the Taliban would quite like to kill, with a request instead they should let them through to the airport. In written and verbal communications, according to Politico, General Frank McKenzie, commander of US Central Command, and Rear Admiral Peter Vasily, head of US forces on the ground, have referred to the Taliban as our Afghan partners, which they might as well, as they've inadvertently gifted them $83 billion worth of highly sophisticated military equipment, including Black Hawk helicopters and A-29 attack aircraft. Taliban fighters have been pictured carrying US-made M4 carbines and M16 rifles and driving US Humvees. Now, some of that equipment won't be usable without training and logistical support. Even so, it's a heck of a haul. Britain may not have been handing details over to the Taliban, but they might as well have been, since they managed to evacuate the British embassy and leave papers that were identifying Afghans that had been working for them just lying around, to be discovered by the Taliban and also by a British journalist. It has been an extraordinary episode. Right now we can only note the humiliation and hope that the final few days now pass without any more, even worse things happening. One can easily speculate about some of the things that could happen to make it worse. Let's not put words onto any of them and just keep our fingers crossed. Some people have speculated that the Taliban might have turned a blind eye to the attackers, tacitly supporting their action. That seems unlikely, not because the Taliban disapprove in any way with bombing and killing Americans and their own people besides, but simply that ISIS-K is positioned as a rival and a deadly enemy. Indeed, there were reports that as the Taliban was emptying out Bagram prison, They summarily executed a couple of senior ISIS-K figures there. The Taliban deny that they did this, but given some of the people we know that they have killed in the last couple of weeks, it's hardly a stretch to imagine that they did. Carrying out effective attacks under the noses of the Taliban sends out exactly the wrong message to the young and disgruntled fighters of the country, and they're very vulnerable at the moment because the country is necessarily in chaos. A bunch of people unused to governing have wandered into the offices of state in a country that's never happily functioned as a coherent nation anyway. Most of the civil servants who kept it running are too scared to go to work because they assume that they'll be killed, and they might well be right. And of course, a lot of foreign funding, which had been flowing into the country, has now come to a screeching halt. Although that may renew in due course, depending on talks with Russia, China and Iran. The Taliban already sought to pass the blame for the attacks onto the United States, saying that the attack took place in an area that was under Western control, which may be true, but they only got there by passing through the very active cordons that the Taliban have had to screen and obstruct the people that wanted to get to the airport. In their opposition to the Taliban, ISIS-K is simply reflecting the contempt felt generally by ISIS, the global organisation, which has called the Taliban's victory in Afghanistan a sham. According to the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, ISIS-K launched around 250 attacks against American, Afghan and Pakistani forces, as well as 100 on civilians between 2015 and 2017. They're thought to have up to 1,200 fighters, a number that is likely to grow over the coming period. In the meantime, the evacuation of people from Afghanistan is limping to its inevitable conclusion, which we've known for the last week, but is now unignorable, that many people are being left behind as time runs out. At the time of shooting this video, the UK evacuation process, which has to conclude before the US one, is in its final stage, where all the remaining people to be evacuated are those that are already inside the airport. That is estimated to leave around 1,100 Afghans who would be eligible for evacuation to the UK, leaving them behind to take their chances. About 100 to 150 British nationals are estimated still to be in Afghanistan, some of whom are said to be willingly staying, although what percentage fits that category is unclear. One thing not getting a lot of mainstream media time is the impact the current events in Afghanistan has been having on other Islamist groups in hotspots elsewhere. In particular, jihadists active across Africa have been encouraged by the Taliban's success, and we've seen in the last few days more than 200 people killed in 4 attacks in Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso. In 2021, groups aligned with Al-Qaeda and ISIS have killed around 700 people, and the violence has displaced 7 million in the West African Sahel region, which is also experiencing drought. One of the fears is that some of the sophisticated American military hardware now in the hands of the Taliban could soon be finding its way to Africa via Pakistan. The eyes of the world may be on Kabul, but Africa has been described by Human Rights Watch as rapidly becoming the centre of armed Islamist activity and abuse. Extremist groups thrive where countries are in the hands of incompetent and corrupt governments, something that's not easy to care about until it reaches a critical point and suddenly you find there's this thriving terrorist base that's got its eyes on you. So, for instance, Burkina Faso was until recently one of the more stable countries in French-speaking Africa. Large parts of it are now said to be under the control of Islamists fighting a jihad while also smuggling drugs and trafficking in humans. Right now there are UN peacekeeping troops with a strong French contingent. So for instance 16,000 UN troops in Mali, 300 of them from the UK. The former Conservative Foreign Secretary William Hague said that if the West didn't pay closer attention to Africa, then over the coming decades it is going to have an impact that would make Afghanistan seem like a sideshow. According to the United Nations, half of the growth in the world's population that we expect over the next 30 years will be in just 9 countries, 5 of which are in Africa. Increasingly, that will mean a rapidly more urbanised, digitally connected people. And Hague said, this will be the continent that determines whether most of the world will be using Chinese or American technology and standards. And who's making the most ground there right now? Well, lots of American companies and projects play very cautiously with Africa because of high levels of corruption. whereas China is making the most of its strategic advantage in, not really caring about any of that corruption stuff, so it has become a major investor in Africa. And that's fine, except that it's hard to see large numbers of people coming out of poverty in Africa if standards of governance stay low and rates of corruption stay high. If Chinese investment doesn't care about those things, and let's face it doesn't, then it is likely to end up supporting and prolonging them. And that's the recipe, William Hague argues, for growing anger that will feed the growth of the multiple insurgencies. Now, recognising that, he argued, none of that is about getting large numbers of Western ground forces into more countries. It's not about boots on the ground, but it is about paying more attention to what's going on and working to support African forces in fighting terrorists, as Western countries did in paying for forces to fight al-Shabaab terrorists in Somalia. Now, paying attention to what's happening far away, it's rarely top of our priority list, so, it's not surprising we're not talking about it. But other things not getting as much attention as they should are actually coming from a lot closer to home. So, for instance, evidence of a damaging downside of lockdown and other COVID policies is now beginning to emerge. In particular, the news that for 6 weeks running, deaths in Britain are running above average, and not because of COVID deaths. 10,372 deaths were registered in England and Wales in the week ending August the 13th, according to the UK's Office for National Statistics. Now that's 14% above the 5-year average, and just 544 of them were directly because of COVID-19. Public Health England reports that heart disease, diabetes and cirrhosis are all well above normal levels, with the expectation being that health conditions that weren't treated during the pandemic are now starting to have consequences. That's the most damaging consequence. But the UK's heavy-handed NHS app and its resultant so-called pingdemic, where large numbers of essential workers were automatically ordered into quarantine, even though the settings of the app have now been modified, the chaos caused by the app continues behind the scenes. Supermarket bosses are now saying that the food shortages caused by the pingdemic, and still to some extent by Brexit, is the worst that they've ever seen. Shops and fast food restaurants are struggling to get stock in, particularly because of a shortage of lorry drivers, where there's a shortfall across the industry of 100,000. The Department for Transport has said that it may allow longer lorries on the roads by next year, which could reduce the number of journeys needed for the same amount of product. It seems as though the country will be embracing with open arms Elon Musk's self-driving lorries if and when they actually ever become a reality. This isn't all local, of course. There's been a worldwide shortage of, for instance, computer chips for some time, which is beginning to have real impacts. The shortage comes partially because of disruptions to production from COVID, but also a spike in demand, with large numbers of people working from home demanding electronic equipment in greater numbers. There's even still some hangover from the impact of the blockage of the Suez Canal, all the way back in March. Part of the problem is that so many companies had moved to a just-in-time system, where normally efficient production and transport modes provided what they needed exactly when they needed it, meaning that companies could save money on stock storage, which is fantastic. But such systems have no built-in redundancy, so one or two shocks to the system can turn your just-in-time system into a just-too-late one. The knock-on effects have hit the auto industry hard, which now depends heavily on semiconductors in cars to regulate engine performance, to have safety features, as well as the user digital enhancements. Indeed, there are few modern products now that don't have chips in them. Even the vaccines, according to some people. That's a joke, by the way. Speaking of jokes, it's worth noting that two notable nations have looming elections coming up. Both of them are turning out to be more interesting than anyone expected. Canada is in the middle of an election, one that Justin Trudeau called rather out of the blue for September the 20th. Having lost his majority in the 2019 election, while he was struggling with the reputational damage of ethics scandals and old photos in blackface, he called a snap election the earliest chance that he could by law, hoping to win back that majority. And it seemed a fairly safe bet because they had a substantial 5-point lead in the polls. A substantial lead that evaporated within days of him calling the election. Right now, it's looking like Trudeau is following the same tragic script of that of British former Prime Minister Theresa May, who had a similar moment of opportunity, an opponent widely rated as hopeless and a lead in the polls. Except in her case, it turned out that hopeless Jeremy Corbyn may have been in many ways, but he was quite an effective election campaigner, and Theresa May turned out to be utterly hopeless. So her party went backwards, not forwards, condemned itself to endless Brexit gridlocks. In this case, Trudeau's argument that he needs a proper mandate to finish off COVID-19 and do all that building back better stuff has not had the kindly reception that he must have hoped. Instead, it's been seen by some as a self-interested power grab, and there's been criticism as well for the slow efforts in Canadian evacuations from Afghanistan. A recent poll by Angus Reid Institute put the Liberals just 2% ahead of the Conservatives, and the short timescale of the election doesn't give a huge amount of time to change that momentum. And it's a similar but slightly more complicated picture in Germany, where the governing CDU party of Angela Merkel was easily presumed to be a shoo-in to be providing the next chancellor. They were stable at 20 percentage points ahead of the Socialist SPD and 18 above the Greens, according to Politico's poll of polls. Well, things have been going as badly as you could imagine. The candidate, Armin Laschet, has been staid and underwhelming, and that's when he's on a good day. When he's on a bad day, he's been getting caught on camera, laughing during a speech in the wake of the devastating floods in the country. A look so bad that his party began to plummet in the polls straight afterwards. The left-wing SPD party has risen as the CDU has fallen, so that they're now neck and neck. And if things don't change in the latter part of the campaign, there could end up being a complex three-way coalition that would see the CDU potentially out of power. Now, if the CDU come in with a majority, then they're likely to form that three-way coalition with the Greens and the FDP, a conservative pro-business party. If the Social Democratic SDP party pushes ahead, then they may form an alliance with the Greens and the Left Party. The Greens end up being kingmakers in this scenario. What all this means for the EU, which has rather relied on the rock-solid stability of Angela Merkel's government, remains to be seen. Finally, although President Biden had his mind on other things this week, he did get a secret briefing from his intelligence services about the latest intel on the origins of COVID-19. Now, it was classified, so of course we know its outline conclusion already, which happens to be a big shrug of the shoulders. Both the natural origin and the lab leak option remain equally plausible according to reports. A declassified version will be published in due course, but it doesn't seem as though it's likely to be including any revelations beyond what's already known. Are we ever going to know the truth about where this virus came from? I asked that question a couple of months ago. I suggested then that probably we would only find out if A, we find a third-party animal through which it passed on the way from bat to human, or we got a genuine whistleblower from the Wuhan lab. The likelihood of either seems to be receding, not getting closer. There are times when you can think we're just floating further and further beyond the bounds of reality. And, it's a straight line graph that's just taking us relentlessly in the same direction to a woke dystopia. But then there's some pushback, and you actually think, maybe this is more of a familiar pendulum thing. Last year we had Maya Forstater being lectured by a judge that her belief in the biological reality of women was one that was not worthy of respect in a modern society. And you wondered where the heck that was taking us. Now, that was overturned on appeal, but some really good news came in the form of more and more institutions withdrawing from the Stonewall corporate programme. This week it was the turn of Ofcom, the broadcast regulator. Stonewall, which has a noble history of fighting for the rights and the acceptance of gays and lesbians in society, has increasingly become a mouthpiece for the more extreme trans activist causes. And it had been using its role as a trusted partner with various corporations and government departments to push some of the more radical messages about how people should talk and behave. We've seen various examples of institutional capture in the US, and it seemed as though it was a relentless one-way process, increasingly pushing those institutions to the point where words like mother become seen as problematic to be replaced by birthing parent or birthing person. And you might say that where America leads, the UK tends to follow. People say that. I'm not sure it's ever wholly been true. But it seems it may not be so here, in spite of what Meyer's original judge might have thought. Indeed, the judiciary has started to step in and question, for instance, how children could possibly be in a position to consent to life-changing hormone procedures. And now various other institutions are looking at what groups like Stonewall are saying, and they're thinking, that sounds a bit radical and non-evidence-based. I mean, they may not be outright attacking it in those terms, because we still do have a lot of people worried about saying the wrong thing and all the consequences that can follow. Not everyone. The most recent was the veteran actor Simon Callow, a former champion of Stonewall and its campaigns. He said that Stonewall had taken, quote, a strange turn to the tyrannical. But the institutions, many of them, are voting with their feet, while explaining themselves with weasel words. In Ofcom's case, the words were, "We have considered whether our relationship with Stonewall poses a conflict or risk of perceived bias. An important part of our responsibility is to ensure that we remain impartial and independent." Of course, what Stonewall was supposed to be was a non-partisan expert advisor on how to support and work with LGBT people in the workplace. There should be no risk of bias there. So you read between the lines, you can see that they're saying that they now recognise this has become a divisive player in one of the most contentious public discussions of our time. So yeah, some risk of bias there. And it's encouraging to note that so far, Callow has set off plenty of Twitter trolls. People like Owen Jones have criticised him, but there's no suggestion of him being rendered toxic in the mainstream. He remains uncancelled, in other words. Just a year ago, that was probably unthinkable. We will take steps back as well as steps forward, but perhaps our society hasn't collectively taken leave of its senses just yet. All right, two things of interest this week. One, I have an imitator, albeit not a particularly good one. My attention was drawn when Tony Heller tweeted that he'd released his latest video and it featured me and my climate conspiracy theories. Well, I was intrigued and I watched, and it turned out he's referring to this comment which was left on his blog. "Tony, who pay you for all this nonsense? Why do you continue poisoning the world?" Those of you who have watched my videos taking down Heller's various claims will have spotted that that tone of voice isn't exactly in keeping with what I do here. I mean, never mind the fact this seems like someone for whom English may not be their first language. Who pays you, not who pay you. But in any case, in all my criticisms of Heller, I've never suggested that he does what he does because someone's paying him to. Those are not the kind of arguments that I make. And it's kind of interesting. I've done numerous videos taking on Heller's arguments, and after the first one, he's never responded. Now suddenly someone posts something eminently attackable, pretending to be me, and it appears in his video. Rather makes you think that he never responded to my various other videos talking about matters of substance, because he can't. He has no arguments to bring. Anyway, I pointed out how obvious a fake this was, and he agreed to correct it. 2 days later, it remains uncorrected. Now, whoever did this obviously feels they're onto a roll, because this morning I found this message from Heller. "Did you post this comment on my blog?" Again, no. But this time they've copied and pasted the description on my website, so at least it's my words. Strangely enough, it had never crossed my mind to go promoting my channel by posting about it on Tony Heller's blog. Something of an unorthodox marketing strategy, you would say. I've told Tony Heller I have no interest nor intention in commenting on his blog, and he should just delete any comments there that are claiming to come from me. We'll just have to see if he does it. All fun and games in the playground. Maybe more interesting, I decided that the phenomenon of people's comments disappearing on YouTube was getting to such a stage that I should go to YouTube and ask them what was going on. So I described to them what was happening, that people's comments on my videos were just disappearing randomly. I mean, it seems to be made more likely if you include a link, but it's just not consistent either way. And I've also had commenters confirm that it's happened to them on other channels, not just mine. It's not exclusive to me, which is good because obviously the first thing that you would naturally think is, why is Mallen censoring us? Which I don't. I didn't have high hopes because YouTube is rarely specific about what's going on when you ask these questions, and I got this back. Apparently, our engineers are still looking for ways in resolving this issue, and it may take some time to find a solution for it. Okay, that leaves me barely any wiser, except that it's an issue that they're aware of, and we're just going to have to wait for it to magically solve itself. That's better than it might have been, I suppose. Alright. You'll have noticed that there's been no promos this week. It's a bank holiday in the UK on Monday, and although that doesn't normally stop me, I do need a short break to get a few jobs done before the summer has completely left us. However, I will be back on Friday for the weekly roundup. And it's time to give a quick shout out to the amazing people who support this channel on Patreon. Their support makes it possible for me to make videos on this channel at the pace that I do, and especially important because of the tweaks to the YouTube algorithm that I talked about before in early March that meant that video views to non-subscribed people dropped significantly, a phenomenon which hit a number of news-related channels all at the same time. Their support means that I can tackle the issues that matter in an independent way, regardless of who that might upset. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.